Julia Creek is a small town in outback northern Queensland. The settlement began in 1890 when it was known as Hilton. In 1907 it was renamed after Julia Campbell, the niece of a nearby property owner. The arrival of the railway, primarily for shipping cattle from the surrounding stations, in 1908 gave impetus to further development of the town. By 1920 it claimed a post office, 4 food stores, a chemist, an accountant, a solicitor, a tailor, 3 garages, 3 cafes, 2 hotels, 2 market gardeners, a blacksmith and a one-roomed school. The local council office moved to Julia Creek in 1930 and the streets began to be bitumenised. Today some 400 people call Julia Creek home. The land around was sparsely timbered, with occasional billabongs, and mainly used for grazing cattle. It had been reported that on the 1st of October 1931, a stockman named Greenaway was riding boundary fences. He encountered a bushman named John Hanna, camping by the side of the road, and stopped to chat. Asked why he wasn't camped at the old hut on the north-south stock route at Palmer's Lagoon, the swaggy replied, "I wouldn't camp there, because a man's been murdered there." "Someone's been pulling your leg," replied Greenaway incredulously. "You look at the bottom of the dip, and you'll see something," the bushman remarked. Greenaway rode over to investigate. The dip had not been used for cattle in 15 years. Peering into the dark water, he could see a bag, which he hauled up. Although prepared for his find, he was nonetheless revolted. He had found a bag into which charred human remains had been placed and then thrown into the waterhole. Greenway hastened the 9 miles back to the homestead to report to Mick Byrne, the owner of the station, who phoned the police in Julia Creek. The next day, Mounted Constable Conway rode to Byrne's 400 square mile station, called Wallakalobby, between 70 and 100 miles to the northwest of Julia Creek. He located the bag of remains as he expected. Searching the immediate area, the policeman then found human bones in the ashes of 3 old campfires. The skull had been smashed into splinters, part of the backbone hacked in 2, and most of the major bones chopped at with an axe, indicating the body had been dismembered after death. 2 blackened trouser buttons, a belt buckle and a .32 caliber shell were found among the bones. There were no maker's marks on the buttons or buckle to help with identification. The ashes were sifted to find any possible clue. There were 2 amalgam fillings in the molars in the right lower jaw, which it was hoped a dentist who had done the work could identify. It was estimated the dental work was about 6 years old. Many of the man's other teeth were missing. No eyelets, tacks or aglets were found, indicating the man was not wearing boots when killed, leading to the theory he was asleep when shot through the left eye. Police stations throughout the area began checking through lists of missing men, mostly swaggies, who had been reported in the prior 2 years, in the hope of putting a name to the remains. In the Depression of the 1930s, men would take the train to the terminus at Mount Isa and then start out walking to the stations and little towns dotted on the flat, scorched landscape, seeking work. Some died of thirst. Some were never heard of again. 2 doctors examined the scant remains. Dr. Hogg spent 6 hours piecing the jigsaw of bones together and formed the opinion that the victim was male, aged between 18 and 24, and in life would have stood between 5'2" and 5'4". The bones were still in good condition, which was ascribed to the fact that little rain had fallen recently. The doctors agreed that death had occurred within the past 12 months. Meanwhile, police had interviewed John Hanna, who was able to provide more information. In December 1930, he was at Kenobi Station when another itinerant worker he knew asked him if he had been at Palmer's Lagoon recently and noticed anything. Hanna said he had been there, but nothing peculiar had caught his attention. The other man said he and his 2 mates had seen a fire and stirred it up, which released a hell of a stink. Then he noticed human remains in the ashes. The man said he had not reported his find to police as it would have delayed his work. Police were keen to find this man and the 2 men who worked with him. On the 8th of October, a possible identity for the body was proposed. A man named Frank Robinson Grimson originally from Orange, New South Wales, who had disappeared 12 months earlier. He had been delivering horses to a station near Quilpie, but neither he nor the horses had arrived. The last letter his family had received from him indicated that he was in the Julia Creek area. Frank was 23 and the approximate height of the man who had been found murdered. He also had 2 amalgam fillings. He was missing the middle toe of his right foot, but the foot bones of the victim were so badly damaged this peculiarity could not be used to confirm the identification. If it was Frank, the theory developed that he was murdered in order to steal the horses with him. His brother Steve had left Cumnock 30 years earlier and was never seen again. In mid-October, the newspapers at least were satisfied and declared that Frank was definitely the victim of the ghoulish crime. 2 days later, news was received that Frank had been found at Kuradala, alive and well. He later joined up with the army during World War II. As part of the 2nd 28th Battalion in Egypt, he took part in the fierce fighting against Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein and was wounded and died on the 1st of November 1942, aged 34, just 1 day before the Germans were defeated and broke into retreat. With the remains once again unidentified, the investigation stalled. On the 20th of November 1931, another body was discovered in a paddock by a man mustering sheep, this time near Goulburn, New South Wales. It at first appeared very similar to the Julia Creek mystery. A man had been shot and the body and the gun burnt at Brooks Creek, 7 miles from Bungendore. It was estimated the body had been there about 2 months, although the smoke was spotted on the 26th and 27th of October by a station manager. 2 prospectors had been in the area at the time, but both disappeared suddenly at the same time. It was possible the man had stepped into a fire he had himself built up and shot himself in an elaborate suicide. A confirmed case of a very similar nature occurred the same month, but in Coolgardie, Western Australia. A prospector named Alan Cameron left a note saying he was going to set a fire on top of a hollow log, then climb inside and detonate a stick of gelignite. A constable who investigated found the blasted remains, along with fragments of the man's body. Sydney James Morrison, a former clerk, was identified as the Bungendore victim through a key and his watch, which were on the body when he died. He had left home at Bondi, where he lived with his parents, on the 6th of October 1931, to try his luck prospecting. At an inquest in January 1932, an open finding was delivered. Morrison was known to have an inferiority complex and suffered from depression. Suicide was considered equally as possible as murder, but the fire needed to consume the body would have needed to be fierce and kept burning for hours. Could he have stoked it enough to do this prior to death? His family denied he would have done it himself, no matter how unhappy he was, and that he had been murdered. They said he was physically fit, slept well, had a good appetite, and seemed happy at home. It was also speculated that a mate may have accidentally shot Morrison and burnt the body in a panic to hide the evidence. The Julia Creek victim was never identified, and neither his murder nor the possible murder of Sydney Morrison were solved. Although similar to each other, there were other killings where the body was burned in 1935 and 1936, where the perpetrator was identified and no connection to Julia Creek or Bungendore could be made. In August 1935, at Boona in southern Queensland, 22-year-old Reginald Felix Scott killed his stepfather, Oro Howard Mills. Soon after Mills had married Reginald's mother in 1918, he got his 15-year-old stepdaughter pregnant. She gave birth in 1922 when she was 16. Mills continued to rape his stepdaughter, with 5 children born to them. He threatened to kill his wife and stepdaughter if they did not obey him. Scott and Mills never got on. One day, Mills threw an axe at Scott, which missed the younger man. Scott picked it up and hurled it back at Mills, striking him in the forehead, killing him. He then burned the body. After a 5-hour deliberation, a jury acquitted Scott of murder in October 1935. Ironically, in November 1939, Scott's truck backfired, setting fire to the petrol tank. He received burns to his hands, right arm and right side of the body. On the 23rd of December 1936, 26-year-old James Johnston killed Harry Nelson, aged 60. Johnston claimed that Nelson had swung Johnston's dog around on its leash, and when Johnston became angry, Nelson threatened him with an axe. So in self-defence, Johnston shot the other man and burned the body. A jury took just 14 minutes to acquit Johnston of murder in March 1937. Serial killer Albert Moss, convicted of murder in Dubbo in 1939, claimed he had killed 13 men, and police could find 15 who had vanished in areas where Moss had been. Although never proven to have killed more than the 3 men with certainty, he, or someone like him, could have prowled the outback for years. Whatever really happened at Julia Creek and Bungendore all those years ago will remain forever shrouded in the dark corners of history.